Hey guys, tonight we're slipping past creaky wooden doors and ducking under velvet ropes, stepping quietly into the candlelit world of the Renaissance. Frescoes tower above you, angels float midair, saints bleed tastefully, and every robe glows with a red so deep it looks like it might still be wet. But here's the kicker, that hypnotic crimson, yeah, the one dominating the most revered religious and royal portraits of the 15th century, isn't just made of minerals or flowers or ground rubies. Nope. It's crushed bugs. Literally. Tiny insects, ground into oblivion, smeared lovingly onto the faces of the divine. Welcome to the glamorous world of Renaissance paint. Hope you brought gloves.so. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me where you're listening from, plus what time it is where you are. I always love seeing how far this little sleepover travels, and now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself in Florence, maybe Venice, maybe a cramped studio that smells like vinegar and oil-soaked linen. You're watching an apprentice wrestle a mortar and pestle that's seen things no kitchen implement ever should. There's dried crusts of something red-brown smeared along the rim, and he's grunting while grinding. Bugs. Not just any bugs, either beetle-like creatures that, once dried, crackle like tiny potato chips. This is art. Apparently, the color he's creating is called carmine. Rich, velvety, and eye-wateringly expensive. Artists use it sparingly, like how you guard your last bit of decent shampoo near payday. And if it wasn't crushed bugs, it'd be something worse. Lead, maybe. Mercury. Good times. You wander through the studio and take in the rest of the color palette: black from burnt bones, white from chalk or lead flakes, blue, if you were insanely rich, from lapis lazuli dragged all the way from Afghanistan. But red? Red is the drama queen of pigments. Red demands sacrifice. It's not just the technical feat of extracting it from insects, it's the statement. A deep red signaled power, holiness, wealth. You didn't put that kind of color on some background goat. You saved it for robes, for lips, for martyrs with blood so glorious it seemed to shimmer. And here's where things get weird. See, many Renaissance painters didn't just use this beetle-based red because it looked good. They used it because it felt magical. It had life in it. Quite literally. Vital force, they called it. Something that still twitches in the dust. Okay, yes, that sounds like a villain origin story. But to them, it was just chemistry meets theology. Historians still argue whether artists knew just how far the cochineal bug had traveled to reach their studios. The bugs came from Mesoamerica, modern-day Mexico and Peru, and were harvested by indigenous communities long before Europe ever caught on. Some say the artists were blissfully unaware, thinking the pigment just appeared. Others suggest they definitely knew and chose to look the other way, because here's the real kicker: this red didn't even exist in Europe before the 1500s. At least not like this. Before then, European artists relied on other, duller reds, iron oxides, plant-based dyes, or an earlier insect called kermes. But when cochineal showed up, it blew the others out of the water. Like switching from candlelight to LED. Suddenly, saints looked warmer. Robes looked juicier. Skin tones? Glowing, and just like that, everyone wanted in. But let's rewind a second. You're still standing in this artist's studio, and now he's mixing the beetle powder with gum arabic, a sticky tree sap, to turn it into paint. He's also mumbling something under his breath. Maybe a prayer. Maybe a curse. Because here's the thing, making paint back then wasn't just about art. It was ritual. A kind of alchemy. You had to understand ingredients. Know when to boil, when to dry, how to store everything so it didn't mold or attract rats. There were recipes passed down like sacred texts. Some included instructions like grind under moonlight or speak no words during preparation. You know, totally normal Tuesday behavior, and when he finally applies it, you get chills. That red doesn't just sit on the canvas, it sings. It pulses like it remembers the cactus it clung to, the sun that dried it, the empire it came from. Mainstream history tells us that cochineal became one of the most valuable exports from the New World, rivaling silver. It was traded, hoarded, stolen, and smuggled across oceans. And while the conquistadors were busy pillaging temples, the artists back home were painting their kings in crimson. Because nothing screams divine right to rule like a robe painted with the blood of 1,000 bugs, but the artists? Most of them didn't ask questions. They were too busy trying to keep patrons happy, secure commissions, and not die of lead poisoning before age 40. The Renaissance wasn't all wine and Da Vinci. It was backbreaking, unpredictable, and filled with dangerous materials that nobody really understood. The studio might smell like beeswax and incense, but under that, there's mold, fumes, and definitely one unlucky rat glued to a spilled pot of varnish. And still, through all of that chaos, this color, the beetle-born red, became a cornerstone of some of the most iconic images in Western art. It's in the folds of the Virgin Mary's robes. It's in the blood from Christ's wounds. It's even in background drapes. If the patron had money to burn, you move from canvas to canvas, noticing it now. That signature glow. Sometimes it's mellowed to a rose, other times it's still fire bright. But once you know what you're looking for, it's impossible to unsee. So, as the apprentice carefully lays down the last brushstroke, he steps back. The light hits the red just right, and for a second, it doesn't look like paint at all. It looks like something alive. Which, in a way, it still is. You lean in closer, nose almost touching the canvas, as if the red might whisper its secrets if you breathe on it just right. And that's when the question starts to really itch. What is this bug? Like, seriously, what kind of insect is so pigment-rich it gets shipped across oceans just to become high-end paint? Meet the cochineal. It's not much to look at. Honestly, you'd probably mistake it for a bit of lint if you saw one crawling on your windowsill. These tiny, soft-bodied scale insects spend their entire lives clinging to prickly pear cacti, sucking sap, growing plump, and preparing to become either more bugs or glorified paint. For the unlucky ones, it's death by drying and pulverization. Think of it as the least glamorous spa treatment imaginable, but here's the thing. Inside the female cochineal beetle is a compound called carminic acid, and it's this stuff that creates the rich, deep red. We're talking the kind of color that makes lipstick scream, fabric pop, and Renaissance saints practically glow. Up to 24% of the bug's body weight is this pigment. You know that one friend who sweats coffee? Same idea, except it's dye and way more intense. Of course, it wasn't the Renaissance artists who discovered this magical little creature. That honor goes to the indigenous peoples of Central and South America, particularly the Zapotec and Mixtec cultures of what's now southern Mexico. They were harvesting and cultivating cochineal for centuries, long before Columbus got lost at sea. They didn't just use it for art either. It was in textiles, in ceremonial body paint, even in medicine. And yes, even their nobility understood the power of a color that no one else had done so naturally. When the Spanish arrived, saw people literally farming color, and realized just how powerful the dye could be, their capitalist lizard brains went ping. Forget gold for a second, this bug could fund empires. Within a few decades, cochineal was being processed in massive quantities, packed into linen bags, labeled with elaborate seals, and shipped off to Seville like red dust from heaven. Mainstream history notes that by the mid-16th century, cochineal was Spain's second most profitable export right after silver. That's how big of a deal it was. It wasn't just a color, it was a commodity. A symbol of control. And because of course it became a state secret. See, the Spanish didn't just want to profit from the dye. They wanted to own it. Entirely. No competition. No alternatives. No copycats. They refused to share where the bug came from or how it was harvested. They even spread rumors that cochineal was a type of mineral or seed, just to throw other nations off the scent. Sneaky, right? If Instagram influencers had been around in the 1500s, Spain would have been ghosting DMs left and right. Sorry, can't reveal my source. Lady Beetles sparkles. Meanwhile, the rest of Europe was going wild trying to reverse engineer this new red. England, France, even the Dutch were desperate to figure it out. Explorers were dispatched. Naturalists pored over samples. There were actual smuggling attempts. Picture a guy sneaking bugs through customs in his underwear. Possibly fictional, but honestly? Entirely plausible. Historians still argue whether Spain's secrecy helped or hurt them in the long run. On one hand, it kept the market cornered. On the other, it made everyone else suspicious and just a bit too motivated to crack the code. And while all this global cloak and dagger was going on, the little bugs themselves remained almost laughably humble. They don't bite. They don't fly. They don't even move all that much. Their entire existence revolves around clinging to cactus pads and hoping not to be noticed. Which, unfortunately for them, they very much were. You picture a Mesoamerican farmer gently brushing the bugs off a cactus, drying them under the sun, and then, depending on how red he wants the final product, maybe boiling them with a pinch of lime or alum. Different processing methods meant different shades of red. Some were vivid scarlets. Others, deeper crimsons. Some leaned toward purple. The palette was surprisingly versatile, given the source, but don't get too comfortable with the pastoral imagery. This was labor-intensive stuff. Harvesting cochineal wasn't like scooping up berries. Each insect had to be hand-picked. Think tweezers. Think backache. Think literal tons of bugs just to produce a few pounds of dye. And once the Spanish took over, the scale ballooned into empire-sized proportions. Imagine entire regions turned into red farms. Not metaphorically. Literally red. Red dust in the air. Red on your hands. Red in your lungs. You can almost taste it, earthy, bitter, vaguely like dried cherries and something that doesn't belong in your mouth. Fast forward a few decades, and European artists are suddenly swimming in cochineal. Well, the wealthy ones, anyway. Bottles of deep crimson start appearing in elite studios, and the pigment becomes a kind of signature move. Want to impress a patron? Slap on some carmine. Want your Madonna to pop? Drape her in beetle juice. It's like the difference between printing your resume on regular paper or parchment laced with gold, and the funny part? Many artists didn't know or didn't want to know where it came from. Some called it graina, or grain, as if it was just a colorful spice. Others assumed it came from a kind of coral. One Renaissance writer even suggested it was a dried flower. That's denial in powdered form, but the indigenous knowledge was always there, humming quietly beneath the surface. Passed on in whispers, drawings, and rituals. Cochineal wasn't just a product, it was a relationship. Between people and plants. Between land and labor. Between culture and color. And in some corners of Mexico and Peru, that tradition still survives today. You step back from the painting, mind spinning. What began as a simple stroke of red has now exploded into a transcontinental saga of bugs, blood, secrecy, and stolen legacy. And we've only just cracked open the bottle. You're standing in the middle of a bustling European market now, somewhere between Venice and a whispered bribe. The air stinks of fish, damp parchment, and melting beeswax. Traders shout in 5 languages at once, their carts stuffed with strange sacks and secret powders. Among the bundles of cloves and cinnamon and dubious-looking remedies is something far more dangerous, a small pouch of crimson dust. Labeled vaguely. Hidden carefully. Worth more than gold if you know who to sell it to. And in this moment, you're learning that red, especially this kind of red, is not just a color. It's leverage. Welcome to the underground economy of Renaissance dye. Yes, you heard that right, underground. You'd think red dye wouldn't be the kind of thing people kill over, but you'd be wrong. The cochineal trade quickly fused with another force that loved secrets and didn't mind a little drama, the churchacy. The Catholic Church wasn't just the center of spiritual life in the Renaissance, it was a powerful patron of the arts. That's how half the masterpieces you're familiar with came to exist. But the Church also loved control. And when certain dyes, especially imported ones, became associated with foreign, non-Christian cultures or practices, you can bet the red robes hit the fan. You walk past a cathedral and see a bishop gliding by, his robe swirling like a freshly poured glass of Merlot. That rich color? Cochineal. Probably smuggled in. But bless now, because it's wrapped around someone with a fancy title. This is how you launder a forbidden color. Put it on someone holy and let the halo do the rest. Back in the market, though, things get trickier. The guilds, the official artist collectives, don't like this new red. Not at first. They've spent generations perfecting recipes for plant-based reds and Kermes dyes. The sudden arrival of cochineal throws everything off. It's cheaper, yes. More vibrant, yes. But it's foreign. Unregulated. And worst of all? It works better than what they've got. Historians still argue whether the early resistance to cochineal was about nationalism, economics, or good old-fashioned snobbery. Probably all 3. Some records show guild members calling the dye unstable or impure, which is rich, considering they used ingredients like cow urine and crushed glass in their other paints. But cochineal had one glaring flaw: it wasn't theirs. Then there's the issue of class. Because while the dye was expensive, it was just accessible enough that rising merchant families could start affording it. Suddenly, it wasn't just royalty or clergy in blood-red robes, it was new money. Florentine bankers, Venetian spice traders, people who didn't inherit power but bought their way into it, and nothing screams "I've arrived" like commissioning a portrait in the same shade of red the Pope wears. The church saw what was happening and tried to keep a lid on it. In some regions, they restricted which social classes could wear certain colors. Literally. They called them sumptuary laws, a fancy name for clothing rules. You're a butcher? Sorry, no red. A silversmith? Stick to beige. But these laws were slippery, and the wealthy were very good at pretending to be something they weren't. All it took was the right painting, the right bribe, the right confession. You pass by a workshop and spot an artist fuming over a shipment that never arrived. He was promised 3 ounces of cochineal, and now all he has is a bag of faded madder root. He knows his client will notice. The woman wants her wedding dress in the color of rubies soaked in rain. Try getting that out of a plant. So what does he do? He improvises. Artists of this era were nothing if not cunning. They learned to stretch their pigments, blend cochineal with cheaper fillers, or, when desperate, bribe a sailor for the real stuff. Cochineal became black market gold. Entire supply lines grew around it. Ships rerouted. Merchants whispered. Priests looked the other way. You duck behind a wine cart and overhear a pair of merchants arguing over a dye shipment. One accuses the other of watering down the cochineal with brick dust. The other insists it's just a different shade. A knife appears. You back away slowly. There were even murders linked to dye fraud. That's right, people died for this red. And not metaphorically, like, oh, I'd die for that shade. No. Actual poisonings, sabotage, disappearances. In 1562, a merchant in Antwerp was reportedly thrown into the canal for selling fake carmine to a wealthy patron. The body was found, dyed red. Whether that's true or just Renaissance urban legend, it speaks volumes about the obsession. It wasn't just about fashion either. Red was symbolic of virtue, of violence, of divine love. It meant something. And in a world where messages were hidden in brushstrokes, the difference between a dull crimson and a luminous carmine could shift the entire tone of a painting. Imagine a depiction of the Virgin Mary. Now imagine her robe in a muddy red-brown. She looks tired. Maybe underpaid. But paint her in glowing cochineal, and suddenly, she's radiant. Untouchable. Holy. This wasn't just art, it was visual theology. You walk into a chapel where the entire ceiling looks like it's bleeding light. That's not just skill, it's chemistry. It's also Beetlejuice. Again, and now the politics thickens. As Spain tightened its grip on the cochineal trade, other European powers began scheming. England tried growing their own beetles in Jamaica. France experimented in Algeria. The Dutch? They tried stealing live bugs and shipping them back in tiny glass jars. Spoiler alert, most of the bugs didn't survive the trip. Turns out cochineal are delicate. Like, Paris in February will kill them delicate, but while nations squabbled over who got to paint what, artists continued their quiet work, smuggling, bribing, mixing, praying. Because at the end of the day, a perfect red was worth almost anything. Including bending a few moral or mortal rules, you glance down and realize your hands are stained. A little red dust still clings to your palms. And for a moment, you understand what all the fuss was about. You're standing in a dimly lit workshop now, the scent of linseed oil hanging thick in the air like warm bread that's been left too long in the oven. Wood shavings crunch underfoot. A low fire flickers in the hearth. And there, beside a cluttered table littered with jars, rags, and half-used brushes, sits a man you've probably never heard of. Not Michelangelo. Not Da Vinci. His name is Giovanni Battista Ruopolo. Okay, so not exactly a household name. But he's your doorway tonight into a very specific slice of Renaissance strangeness. Ruopolo is a still-life painter from Naples. He paints fruit, fish, and occasionally, meat. Yes, meat. Let's call it an aesthetic. You move closer to his canvas. At first glance, it looks like an innocent cornucopia, apples, pomegranates, the odd dead bird. But then, that red hits you. Not just any red. The red. The kind that doesn't just sit on the canvas, it sinks into your eyes. You know now where it came from. You imagine the tiny insects, ground down into fine dust, swirled with oil, transformed into pigment, and finally lovingly brushed onto canvas to become the exact hue of a freshly burst artery. But what's weird is this: Giovanni uses this red to paint things that are rotting. A pomegranate, split and leaking. A flayed fish belly, oozing. Meat, sweating under candlelight. Cochineal was supposed to be divine, symbolic, luminous. So why is this guy using it to paint decay? Historians still argue whether painters like Ruopolo were making a moral point, maybe something about the fleeting nature of luxury, the vanity of indulgence, or just that death lurks in beauty's shadow. Or maybe, he just liked the drama. Not every artist was a philosopher. Some were just vibing with the palette, and here's your uncomfortable reality check. Ruopolo's obsession with rot wasn't unique. The 17th century, especially in southern Italy and the Netherlands, developed a whole genre called vanitas. These were paintings that quietly screamed, "Hey, you're gonna die. Enjoy that grape while you can." Artists used skulls, hourglasses, decaying fruit, anything to whisper mortality into your silk-trimmed ear, but the contradiction remains. Why spend fortunes on pigments derived from bugs smuggled across oceans just to paint a bowl of spoiled peaches? It's like buying champagne to water your plants, and yet, there's a method to this moody madness. Cochineal doesn't fade easily. When bound properly, it keeps its vibrancy for centuries. That meant if you painted a festering plum in carmine, it stayed plummy long after the real fruit rotted away. Symbolism? Check. Craftsmanship? Double check. You walk across the room to another canvas. This one's different. It's a portrait. A young girl in velvet, hands folded, gaze steady. Her dress is trimmed in red so bright it seems to pulse in the firelight. The same red used to paint the rotting fish, now glowing like an ember against her pale skin. Here's where it gets interesting. Some artists began to use cochineal in layers, not just as a top coat, but as a kind of luminous base. Imagine painting red underneath the flesh tones. A trick of transparency, it gave the skin a lifelike warmth. A pulse beneath the surface. Suddenly, you're not looking at paint, you're looking at someone who might blink if you wait long enough. You remember that Ruapolo still life, and now you wonder, was he trying to contrast decay with vitality? Rot with radiance? Or was it just that cochineal was finally accessible enough to get weird with, because by now, the pigment is everywhere? Not just in the sacred. Not just in the portraits of dukes. But in the strange and intimate corners of daily art. Miniatures. Altarpieces. Carnival masks. Even fake wounds for religious plays. Yes, theatrical blood made with bug juice, how's that for realism? And it didn't stop at paint. Cochineal made its way into textiles, dresses, tapestries, carpets. If it could be dyed, it was. Imagine a banquet hall filled with nobles wearing beetle red garments under candlelight. A room that didn't just look expensive, but practically screamed in saturated crimson. Red as a power move. Red as sensory overload. Red as a statement, we can afford to bleed insects. Of course, the dye was temperamental. It didn't love humidity. It reacted badly to certain mordants. It required skill to handle, especially in paint form. One wrong ratio and your luscious crimson turned to brownish mush. So, artists guarded their recipes like dragon's gold. You get the sense that if someone had walked into Ruapolo's workshop asking for his carmine blend, they'd have left with a polite smile and a silent curse. You step outside, blinking in the late afternoon light, and walk through narrow Neapolitan streets. Behind shutters and doors, you know that more artists are experimenting. Not just with color, but with meaning. Some see cochineal as sacred. Others, decadent. Some see it as merely practical. But all agree on one thing, it changes the canvas. Even Michelangelo, famously difficult and sometimes straight up rude, was rumored to dabble with carmine in his later years. Though never openly. He was a bit of a pigment snob, preferring earth tones and traditional fresco methods. Still, whispers say he once used cochineal to accent the veins on a sculpted arm, because no natural ochre could match that subtle throb. Was it true? Maybe. Maybe not. Historians still argue whether the red-tinted shadows on some of his sketches are cochineal or just aged iron oxide. Either way, the myth persists, and here's the final twist of the knife. Even as the pigment spreads across Europe, the bug that created it remained largely anonymous. Most artists never saw a cochineal beetle in their lives. They worked from powders and pastes. A disconnect between source and substance that mirrors how most of us consume the world now, removed, sanitized, unbothered. But tonight, you know better. You know the red on these canvases once had legs. Tiny ones. That it clung to a cactus in the heat. That it died, was dried, crushed, soaked, mixed, and finally, lovingly placed onto something sacred or absurd, and that, in a strange way, gives the color a pulse. You slip through a heavy velvet curtain now, and suddenly you're inside a grand Renaissance palace. Think gilded ceilings, tapestries thick as your arm, and that unmistakable scent of damp stone mixed with crushed herbs like a giant ancient perfume. You settle into a carved wooden chair near a long, sunlit gallery lined with portraits. All these faces stare down at you with their painted eyes, their lips forever caught in polite smiles or fierce glances. But there's one thing they all share, a splash of that unmistakable, intense red dot. It's impossible to ignore how cochineal became more than just a pigment, it became politics. When a ruler showed up in a portrait wearing cochineal red robes, they weren't just flaunting fashion, they were broadcasting power, influence, and divine favor. The red had a language all its own, and every brushstroke was a carefully crafted sentence. You might recognize some of the most famous portraits. That blood-red cloak? It might be Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, the man who literally ruled half of Europe in the 16th century. His painters knew exactly what they were doing. Red meant authority, and cochineal meant the best possible red. But here's a little secret that probably won't survive this evening's soothing vibe. Some of those reds were so bright, so mesmerizing, that they could make even the most arrogant noble look, well, a bit ridiculous. Imagine that famous red cape on a pompous aristocrat who, let's face it, probably had zero idea about Beetles and dye trades. It's like they were unwittingly wearing the badge of a giant insect conspiracy. Still, the prestige attached to the pigment was real. Some nobles reportedly sent agents across Europe to hunt down the rarest cochineal sources. There were bribes, false passports, and secret letters disguised as grocery lists. This wasn't just about vanity, it was about crafting a legacy. Red was the royal color, red was the color of the church, red was the color of the ruling class, and yet, the supply was fragile. The bugs were harvested almost entirely in Spanish colonies, mainly Mexico. So a sudden storm, a failed harvest, or piracy on the high seas could send the price skyrocketing overnight. Imagine the panic in a palace when the painter calls up and says, "Sorry, no cochineal this week. Your red cloak will have to wait." Historians still argue whether the dependency on cochineal might have indirectly influenced European colonial policies. After all, protecting the source of a prized pigment was more than just economic, it was strategic. That's why Spanish viceroys guarded their cochineal farms with an almost religious zeal. Smuggling the bugs out of the colonies was punishable by death. And for a time, that worked, but human nature being what it is, cracks appeared in the armor. Smugglers began sneaking beetles in carefully sealed vials hidden inside religious artifacts, boots, and even hollowed-out loaves of bread. One infamous story involves a Jesuit priest caught with a secret cargo of live bugs strapped to his chest. The church quietly shuffled him off to a monastery in the mountains, and the beetles vanished into legend. You wander to a tapestry in the corner, its red still vibrant after centuries. Imagine the hands that wove it, dyed thread soaked in cochineal, fingers stained like painters' palettes. The tapestry was a statement: you're not just a noble, you're connected to the farthest corners of the globe. Your power flows through a chain of crushed insects, cacti, and pirate ships, but not everyone was happy with this status quo. As you look around the gallery, you spot a few faces painted with more muted, earthy reds, madder, kermes, even simple vermilion. Artists and patrons who either couldn't afford cochineal or preferred traditional dyes clung to their roots. There was a quiet, simmering resistance to the bug-based pigment. Some saw it as a symbol of colonial exploitation. Others just thought it was a passing fad. You overhear a scholar muttering about the ethics of pigment as you leave the gallery. And yes, that phrase existed even back then, though they probably called it the sins of color. The debate continues today. Can a color so beautiful ever be free of its darker history? And speaking of dark, here's a fringe tidbit that might make you raise an eyebrow. Some secret alchemists believed cochineal had supernatural properties beyond color. They mixed the pigment into potions, thinking it could protect against evil spirits or boost fertility. Not exactly mainstream, but hey, Renaissance Europe was full of people who mixed science with superstition like a cocktail. It wasn't all brush and canvas. As the sun sets behind the palace's stained glass windows, you realize that cochineal wasn't just a pigment, it was a story of ambition, greed, art, and power. A story told in red, written with the blood of tiny creatures and the dreams of empires, and in a way, every painting you've seen tonight whispers that secret in its crimson hues.